Well, I'm Margaret Novak. I'm here with
Eric Kallenborn.
Adan Alvarado.
And we're going to talk about graphic novels in the classroom. If you guys could tell me where you teach and what it is you teach.
I teach at Bloom High School in Chicago Heights. I teach a course called College Reading Seminar, which essentially focuses on SAT prep, but then also on like general comprehension, critical thinking when it comes to comprehending a variety of media.
I teach at Shepherd High School in Palos Heights, and I teach AP Language this year, and then I have creative writing, film and literature, and graphic novels, which is a course that I started. Ronell and I actually, a colleague Ronell Whitaker and I started, we put it in a course description to get graphic novels approved. Last year was kind of our official trial run, and then it got approved for this year, so,
okay.
Yep.
That's cool. And so, I guess my first question is, have you always used graphic novels in the classroom, or was this a slow process?
Well, I started at a school district that was anti-comics and graphic novels in the classroom, even though I hadn't been I wasn't extremely interested in using them back then when I first started teaching. It was like 13 years ago. But I was interested in a couple titles, but the department chair was like, no, there's no room for comic books in the classroom, which I thought was kind of weird. And then when I went over to Shepherd, they were way more open to the idea. There was a teacher who was already using mouse instead of Knight for the sophomores. Right. And she's like, oh, I use this book. And then that was about 9 years ago. I started using mouse. And then we slowly started building other titles in, like Gareth Hines' Beowulf and some of his other Shakespeare adaptations. And now we have a course where, it's dedicated to, we have about maybe 15 graphic novels, or we have a class set of that graphic novel in our building, which is pretty, in our district, which is pretty awesome. So kind of primarily over the past 4 or 5 years, splashed throughout before that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is only my third year teaching, but from the very beginning, I used them. I actually got, I was Eric's student teacher and got paired up with him because of graphic novels. Like in my application, talked about how I want to incorporate graphic novels in the classroom. I'm a big fan, and I think it's a great medium to use. And then got the interview with the DC at that time, who said, I want you to meet somebody who's interested, who's been doing the same thing. He was already sort of off and running with it. And he said, so please come and talk. And we talked, and he's like, all right. So I did my student teaching for him. So right from the beginning, doing my student teaching, I got to use Fahrenheit 451. I got to use Spider-Man. So from then on, just seeing the impact that it had, I was already a fan and knew I wanted to, but then actually getting to practice it while student teaching and seeing the impact that it had and how engaged students were, I was like, I'm on board. So for me, since I've started my career, it's definitely something that we do every single semester.
So what was your inspiration? I looked on your website and you talked about how you've always loved comic books, even when you were a kid and stuff. What was your inspiration into bringing it into the classroom?
Well, I had a pretty big moment where I was taking my wife to the doctor, and I was about to teach Beowulf with my seniors. It was my junior lit. It was AP lit. And I stopped at the library to just grab a graphic novel for something to read in the waiting room at the doctor's office, and I saw that there was a Beowulf one. And I was like, hey, I'm going to be teaching this. So I grabbed it. It was at the Oak Lawn Library. And I read it while I was in the waiting room waiting for my wife's appointment, and I was like, this was amazing, because it was super close to the original text. There was a lot of the original text in the book, and it was way easier to get through, and I thought my kids would have a much easier time with it. So then I did I did an experiment with kids who read the regular text and the graphic novel text and how much time they spent reading and quiz grades and stuff like that. But that title was really the one where I dip my toes in the water of the benefit of graphic novels almost full-time in the classroom, and it was pretty awesome. So that was that Gareth Hines' Beowulf, which is a great adaptation.
What is your inspiration?
For me, I just knew how much of an impact they had on me. Like when I was reading them, I knew how invested I was with the characters. I knew how much the visual element added to that sort of empathy that you can have for characters that you sort of have in television shows and in films, that if you're not an avid reader, might not always get when reading, words on a page. Yeah. So I just felt that it was just a really important and beneficial tool that I would want to incorporate in my classroom.
What about you? In your experiment, you gave them the choice to choose the regular text or the graphic novel. Do you keep doing that? Do you think it's better to let them have that choice?
Well, choice is always important in the classroom, but in my graphic novel class, we're reading class sets of graphic novels. Although I do a couple lit circle projects where the kids will get to pick between like 6 books. But when I do it with like a normal class, if there's a regular text and a graphic novel text, I'll let them pick which one they want to read. And usually it's about half and half. Although the numbers are starting to skew more towards the graphic novel a little bit. Mm-hmm. But for a normal AP class, it'll be about half and half, which is, every time I've done it, it's been about right there, percentage-wise.
Do you give them the choice in your classroom?
We've done like lit circles as well, but for the most part, resources are always an issue, so we don't have enough resources to give them that sort of options when it comes to graphic novels.
Yeah.
And I've never done I haven't done like Fahrenheit 451. When I did Fahrenheit 451 with Eric, I just did the graphic novel. Like we'd done Brave New World. We were going to do 1982. I was like, I don't even want this to be an option. Let's just take on another medium, introduce them to another medium, allow them to tackle this theme with an entirely different medium. So we just did Fahrenheit 451. So I haven't had the opportunity to offer them like options, like when you do Hamlet, did you have to do the traditional text and then the graphic novel? I haven't done that in the class yet. When we're doing a graphic novel, we're covering that graphic novel. But with lit circles and stuff, they have choices. And sometimes we have independent reading, and I would say that still a large majority of them with my classroom library, which is pretty large, will go towards graphic novels. In my school, a lot of them like manga as well. So either one of those.
Do you see yourself continuing to use more graphic novels more often, or keeping it a blend?
Well, the graphic novel class is fairly popular at our school, so I mean, yes, I plan on using them more. I'm probably going to incorporate some graphic novels into my film class next year too, to talk about like storyboarding a film, because that's really what a graphic novel is. It's a storyboarded film for the most part. Talk about how, when we're laying out film scenes, we can use graphic novels as an example of how you could do that. So I'm actually probably going to be putting them in a little bit more next year. Because I don't have any AP language next year. It's just senior elective, so that'd be fun.
Okay.
He's a bit in a different boat because he has like a graphic novel course.
Yeah.
I'd say we're going to keep him right. I think we've sort of found a sweet spot in terms of how many we use. Because what we really try to do is teach media literacy in that course too. So we move from lyrics to poems to graphic novels. See you later. To graphic novels to film and television shows. So we sort of bounce around, but I think as long as we're covering, we do some sort of graphic novel related activity a couple times a quarter, whether it's the full graphic novel or we do excerpts.
You guys actually mentioned film, and that was another question I had. We look at Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde and stuff, and it's all plays, it's visual aspects. So we do have film classes in the high school, but what do you think about studying movies in literature? Or like if we were to start looking at contemporary films, that have very good screenplays, start looking at in a literature classroom.
Were you on that new literacies panel?
I was on the new
literacy panel. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'm 100% supporter of that. I think, it's like comprehension should span all mediums. Like, what is comprehension? What is literacy? Should span all mediums. Because the way a lot of students might come into the classroom and the way that they sort of take in a film is it's not the wrong way. It's just they do it often for entertainment instead of actually analyzing what's going on and why the director is making the decisions that he made and why the screenwriter wrote this particular scene, right? So we'll take a look. We took a look at Fruitvale Station, and it's about a true story. But only the end is true. The rest is just sort of narrative fiction about what Oscar Grant did on that final day before he was killed on that train station platform. So we took a look at why the director and why the writer incorporated all these scenes. Why does Oscar Grant meet this stray dog on the street and sort of empathize with it, and then that stray dog later gets hit by a car? Like we talked about, like using different narrative tools and things like foreshadowing and symbolism and all these other things. So like once you start breaking down films in a more complex and nuanced way, I think it's incredibly important and goes a long way in understanding the film. And I think it's really important for our students to do. So like we do that with lyrics, we do that again with poems, with graphic novels. All of it's about having that close reading experience or close viewing experience in terms of of films or television shows that allow them to understand the work better. So I think that's a huge part, and it's the way they're learning now, right? Like everything they do is, for the most part, visual.
Yeah.
So if we can't teach them to read those visuals, to understand and comprehend what they're attempting to say and the bias and the meaning and everything that comes behind them, I think we're doing them a great disservice.
And you can also, it also cuts down on plagiarism too, what I'm finding a little bit, because like when kids write about a movie or a graphic novel, especially if your questions are unique, you can't really find answers on the internet. You have to kind of analyze it yourself and kind of create, like some of the questions I come up with for my graphic novel assessments, like those don't, the Hawkeye, like answers to my Hawkeye questions aren't on the internet. You know, they're not like analyzing like Polito's work versus Aha's work. Like it's just not like, it's not on there really. I mean, people talk about it, but not the types of questions I'm asking. So the kids, they have to read. You know, when you're reading like Catcher in the Rye, and if you're doing an essay on Catcher in the Rye, you can just Google Catcher in the Rye quotes. It'll tell you the quotes. It'll tell you the page numbers. You don't even have to read the book to write an essay on Catcher in the Rye. But you do have to read a comic book in my class or a graphic novel in order to write that essay, because it's obvious if you didn't read it, right? So I think, and film's the same way too. We're talking about film scenes. If you ask questions that are unique enough to a film, it's almost impossible to plagiarize. Yeah. And I don't do the same projects every year. I do different movies, different projects, different questions, so the kids can't even like share their materials from the kids from year to year. Try to. That's a big problem, is cutting down on that.
There's no Spark Notes for movies.
Right. I mean, especially if they're more like avant-garde, more independent, right? You might see something for like The Godfather or Citizen Kane, but or Psycho, but you're not going to find a study guide for
especially if you're asking those like higher order thinking questions. Like they're not comprehension questions. Those like they can, you know, look for the plots on whatever Wikipedia or whatever and find the plots. But if you're going beyond comprehension, which you should, they're not things that they can just sort of look up. And if they can, they're reading like, you know, these really well thought out essays about Psycho, in which case that's a win in my book. If they're actually going there to read to, you know, sort of form their answer, okay, awesome.
Yeah,
I was thinking when I was trying to think of like good contemporary examples, and one that popped in my head that just came out was Fences, which was a play before that too. So I'm like, and it did really well, and thought that would be a good example to use like in analyzing a film, because it's very much dialogue oriented and conversation.
When you do something like Hamlet, right, which I've taught a number of times, where like there are a number of really good film adaptations of that play. So you talk about like the Kenneth Branagh version, you talk about the Mel Gibson version, you can talk about the Ethan Hawke version. You know, there's like so many good ones, and each one's way different than the other one. So you can show the same scene from 4 different films and then talk about the decisions the director and the actors have made, and what is that, what insight does that give us of the character.
The way the line is read, and
right, the way the line is read, the way it's cut, even the way the scene is cut. Like, people aren't talking about that, right? They're reading Shakespeare in class.
Sorry. Yeah, it was
the kind of lightsaber.
That was my lightsaber.
That's awesome. You know, if you're creative enough, you can really kind of open the doors to unique experiences that kids aren't getting in other English classes.
Yeah, and oftentimes, like, you can use, like, clips, too, right? Like, we just use clips from Fences. You were just talking about Fences, and we used clips recently from Fences to talk about, like, adulthood and transitioning into parenthood, right?
Is that out?
Yeah, it's out.
Okay.
Yeah, so, like, so we just looked at clips between the relationship between, you know, drawing a blank on the main character's name in Fences. Whatever, the Troy and his son, right? So like how they sort of interact and how Troy treats his son, but then he also tells a story about how his father treated him, right? So like drawing those similarities between how those relationships sort of come about. And then we took a look at Sandra Cisneros' like 11 about adulthood, and then we paired that with excerpts from Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba's Day Tripper, which is a graphic novel, and it talks about coming of age and growing up and becoming a parent. So like we just combine all those things to give kids like a different look at different mediums, all covering the same topic or theme. And it works out pretty well, because then they're sort of engaged and moving in and out of different things, as opposed to just always sort of, you know, reading some words on a page.
Yeah. Well, I was doing another project for another teacher, and I was talking about rhetoric, and I was talking about the rhetoric of 9/11. and she mentioned that it would
Professor
be...
Haig? No?
No, it was not Professor Haig. It was Dr. Morris. And she said it would be a great idea to do like a cross-curriculum where you're looking at it in the English classroom when you're studying rhetoric, and then they're also analyzing that time period in the history classroom. And I was thinking that would work great with like Maus, if you were reading Maus in literary class, and then they were analyzing that time period in the history class. Do you guys ever do cross-curriculum like that, working with another
A little bit. Yeah, well,
class?
I did it with March this year. March, John Lewis's story during the Civil Rights Movement. And I tried to sync it up as much as possible with the AP U.S. History course to see if they were, when they were doing like that time in U.S. History, and seeing if we could sync it up. So like, we'd be talking about the same characters and the same figures and the same movements together. It's hard to do like a multiple planning unless you have like a block where you teach with that teacher for 2 hours and like you both kind of work together for those 2 hours to do your thing. It's really hard to both stay on the same page, especially because I do like so many like unique things in my class and I'm kind of jumping around a lot. It's hard for me to stay on the same page with another teacher for like a unit. And it's not one of my strengths. I'm not going to say like I should be able to do that better, but unfortunately I don't.
I'm not.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll echo Eric too. I think it would be incredibly beneficial if we could get more on the same page with other disciplines, and sort of have that sort of cross-discipline planning. And there's so many great texts that can be used in a variety of disciplines. You can use like there's graphic novels like Trinity that could probably be used in 3 different disciplines, right? Like it talks about the science behind the atomic bomb, and then it also talks about Oppenheimer's regrets about that, which I think could be really dissected in a literature English class. But then it's also obviously talking about the history of World War II, right?
Yeah.
So like it really works really well, and I think there's a lot of graphic novels that March being a great example of that offers those opportunities. I think it is really difficult, and you have to have the people on board that are willing to sort of like-minded people who are willing to sort of go along with it and try to plan, because sometimes lesson plans are rigid. Sometimes the curriculum that they offer or that they require you to teach is a little more rigid and doesn't allow that flexibility. And sometimes people are just not as flexible, and myself included. So I think it's a great idea. I think it's important. I think we should definitely try to incorporate that more in education. I don't know.
I think it would be great for students offering those different levels of looking at one thing and different ways of analyzing one event. Looking at it from a history standpoint, looking at it, the rhetoric of it, looking at, the reactions to it and all that.
Yeah, and when you're talking about it in multiple classes too, that repetition kind of works in your memory, so you remember those times and those people and those things more, where it's not just in one class and then you forget it because you have 6 other classes or 7 other classes.
Because I've heard people saying they read Maus in their history class, not in their literature class. So I feel like that would be something like that would be easy to cross over if you could get teachers on board with the idea.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
So, what other? Oh, when I was looking at your analysis of how you, when you did your experiment with Beowulf and looking at the different times, you did talk a lot about the time aspect of it and how long it takes to read a graphic novel versus how long it takes to read the book. And I read an article too about someone, a teacher who had read a graphic novel for the first time, because she was like, what's the big deal about all this? And so she decided to check it out. And she said she found herself, she had to slow down reading it. Because you can tend to sort of breeze through a graphic novel. Do you think time is like a really huge aspect of it? Of reading the graphic novels? Do you have to remind students to slow down and really analyze it?
I think the questions I ask allow them to go back in and kind of analyze it. I think the great thing about a graphic novel is it's a movie you watch at your own pace. So, you know, like when you're watching a film and something passes and you're like, damn, I wish I could go back and watch that again or listen, what did they say or what's going on here? But a graphic novel, you don't have to worry about that because you can just turn the page back or you can just stop at read that page over again.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a really interesting way to take in that media. I think that kids feel a sense of accomplishment because they finish a graphic novel way quicker than a normal book. So, you know, when you're building, it builds confidence in the reader. So once a student has that confidence of, hey, I read like 5 books this semester already, you know, and then hopefully they take their participation as a reader more seriously, and then they slow down in the future when they're reading other books or, you know, not as intimidated by books anymore in general. But no, I think it's partially on the teacher to ask the right questions to allow that student to delve into the parts that they want that student to. Because you can't just say, slow down. You know, it's not.
Yeah.
You have to kind of put stuff in there for them to make them kind of slow down in certain parts or go back to certain parts and look at it. But yeah, so I mean, you can read it, analyze it, go back in and answer the questions in the time it would take a normal kid to read like a quarter of a normal book.
Yeah.
You know, which is fantastic, I think.